Alright, now let's start looking at the 3D viewport closer. In this lecture, we'll go over the different types of shading for the 3D viewport and some options you have to customize it. Right now, the scene is being displayed in solid shaded view, which means that the objects are being rendered as solid and it gives the scene some basic lighting. This shading ignores any other lights you have and just uses a built-in lighting setup that you can actually customize in the user preferences. And I showed you how to customize the lighting before, but I'll show you again. You can go into the Edit menu, down to Preferences, and over to the Lights tab. Up here we have the studio lights, which is the built-in lighting. We can just expand the editor and then edit the studio light. And right here is the direction of the lighting, for example. We can move that around to change the direction of the light. And we can change the coloring and the other lights used as well. But I'm going to click on that to cancel it, and I'll close that out because I like the default lighting setup. It keeps all of the faces that are facing the camera or the view that you're in illuminated. So that's just a lot more convenient and functional for modeling. Now there's a couple different ways you can change the shading. The 4 shading options can be found as icons right up here. Right now we're set to solid shaded view. And another way to access the different shading modes is by pressing the Z key over the 3D view. This opens up a pie menu which has the 4 different shading modes. So now if we click on wireframe, then the objects are no longer solid. We instead can see all the edges that actually make up the models. Solid shading and wireframe modes are modes you'll be modeling in a lot. And a quick way to get into wireframe mode is if you're in any other mode, you can simply press Shift and Z and it'll switch over to wireframe mode. Then if you press Shift and Z again, it switches back to the mode you were in previously. Now whatever mode you're in, you'll have extra options in the top right viewport shading menu here. So in solid shaded view, we have different lighting options at the top here. So the studio lighting option right here is what uses the built-in lighting to shade your objects. Now like I mentioned, by default, this built-in lighting follows the view around so that any part of the objects facing you are always illuminated. Now if we click on this option right here called World Space Lighting, this actually locks the lighting in position so that it doesn't follow the view around. I find it's usually more useful to keep that disabled and use the built-in lighting that follows the view around. But if you do enable this option, you can also rotate the world by using the rotation option right here. But let me keep that disabled. Now you can also click this thumbnail right here for a collection of different studio lighting setups. And if you created your own studio lighting setup in the user preferences, then that option will appear in this menu here as well. Let me set it back to default. Now the next lighting option is called Matte Cap, and this will make every object reflect the chosen environment. When you click on the thumbnail here, you can see we have a whole collection of these to choose from, and you might want to use certain ones for different tasks. For example, this one here is especially good when sculpting. And if you want to zoom in to your surfaces and analyze them for any flaws, you might want to use one of these striped ones, or any of the really reflective matte caps like the red one here. Now back up in the menu, we also have a little icon here, and this option will just flip the matte cap from left to right, if that is useful to you at all. And there's also this gear icon here, which will show us the lighting preferences, and this is going to allow us to install our own custom matte caps if we want to. And I'm going to show you how to do that in extra content that will be added in shortly after the course is published. But for now, let me close this, and let's go over the next type of lighting called flat. And as the name suggests, this will shade everything as a flat color, and you can define this color for each individual object in the material properties. So for example, if I select that building right there and we go over to materials, let me scroll down to the bottom to viewport display, and there's the color for it here. So let's change this to maybe a brown, and let me select the environment there, or the terrain I mean, and we'll make this a green. And there you go. Now if I go back up into the menu and I switch it back to Matte Cap or Studio, you can see that the viewport display color in the materials is affecting those lighting options as well. So each of those modes are affected by the viewport display color because we have the color down here set to material. If we switch this over to object, then the material viewport display color isn't affecting everything. Instead, the object colors will be affecting everything. Now let me show you where you can find the object colors. So we have the terrain selected. So I'll go over to the object properties here, and down here in viewport display, you can see we have a color option. So we can change that here. So now the object color is affecting this lighting option, but also the other ones as well. And that's pretty much the gist of what all these color options down here do. So I'm going to go through real quick and show you exactly how each one of them affects the lighting. Now, if your objects have any vertex paint that you'd like to visualize in the 3D view, you can use the vertex option here, and that will use the vertex paint as the coloring. And we can switch this to single, and we have the option here to change the color for everything in the scene. We can switch this to random, and that will give every object a random color, which can come in handy. And then we can set this to texture, which will display your image textures on your models in solid shaded view. So this can be really good for a quick preview of how your image textures look on your object. Make a note though that this will only display the image texture node that is selected. So for example, if I split the window here and head over to the shader editor, you can see we have three image textures here. The top one is the diffuse image texture, which is what's displaying right now because that's selected. But if we wanted to visualize the normal map image texture, I can click on this node, and now that's the one that's being displayed. Alright, so that does it for those options. Let me join these windows back together. And let's go back up in this menu here. Now let's go over the background options right here. Theme here, we'll use the background color set in the theme for the 3D viewport, which can be changed in the user preferences. World here, we'll use the world's viewport display color. So if I switch it to that, and we head over to the world properties here, down in the viewport display panel, we can switch the color for the background. And now the viewport background option here just lets you pick a color right here in the menu. And let me reset this back to theme now. Now one last note on these, both the color options here and the background options down here can be set differently for both solid shading and wireframe views. So for example, if I switch over to wireframe view, I can set the color options here to be random. And if I press Shift and Z to go back to solid shaded view, you can see the color options are still set to texture. And I can set them to material if I want, and it just saves the different settings between the different shading modes for you. Now let me reset things back to default real quick. Now let's move on to the miscellaneous options down here, and we'll start off with back face culling, which will only draw the front side of faces, not the back side. Every face has two sides, one side pointing outward and one side pointing inward. Take the terrain here for example. All the faces on the surface here are all pointing outward, and then if we go underneath here, all of these faces are pointing inward. Now these faces that are pointing inward aren't normally the ones that are being seen, so what we can do is turn on back face culling, and all the inside of the faces won't be drawn. They'll be invisible like that. And this can possibly be used to speed up viewport drawing or prevent certain faces from obstructing a view, or just to see if any faces are pointing the wrong direction. So let me turn that back off. And real quick before we move on, let me set this to single, just so everything has the same shading. I'm kind of sick of looking at the green. Now let's move on to X-ray, and this is actually a significant part of this lecture. We're going to change something with this to make it more like 2.79. So with the X-ray option enabled, it will make everything transparent based on this percentage here. Now the hotkey to toggle that on and off is Alt and Z, and that's an important hotkey to know because this mode does come in handy when you're modeling a lot, and there's also an icon for it up here to toggle it on and off. Now X-ray mode is actually extremely important for modeling in solid shaded view, which is something you'll be doing a lot. For example, if I select that building, press / on the numpad to go into local view, and let's zoom into these disks up here. And I'll press tab to go into edit mode. You can see when we're in X-ray mode, we can not only see the vertices on the surface of the object, but we can see the vertices behind the surface as well. If we press Alt and Z to disable X-ray, we can only see and select vertices that are on the surface. So let's say, for example, I wanted to move the bottom of this down. I'd have to select that vertex, swing around to the inside, and select that one as well. Then I can move both of these up or down. Whereas if I press Alt and Z for X-ray mode, I can select both of these without having to swing around to the backside. But also, having those vertices on the backside blocked often comes in handy as well when you just want to work with vertices on the surface and don't want to accidentally select some of the vertices in the back. So that's why it's important to remember the Alt and Z hotkey so you can easily toggle between them. I do have some complaints about this though. First off, it's mainly used for editing. So the fact that when an X-ray is enabled, if I get out of edit mode, the object itself is still transparent seems inconvenient in my opinion. And if I go back to global view by pressing / on the numpad, you can see this mode makes the entire scene half transparent, not just the object you're working on, which I think is unnecessary. So personally, I find it much more useful to leave X-ray enabled in solid shaded view but crank the X-ray value up to 1. That way nothing is actually transparent, but if we select an object and go into edit mode, all of the wireframe and the edges and the vertices, they are all still transparent. I can still select through the surface as long as X-ray is still enabled. So that takes away any of the actual transparency of the object, but it leaves you the functionality in edit mode. And then you can still toggle X-ray on and off by pressing Alt and Z whenever you need to. Now, this is how things worked in 2.79 and older versions, which I think is a more functional default setting to have, since it'll be used more often like this than having all your models in your scene transparent. Plus, you actually still have that option just by going up into the menu here and adjusting the X-ray values whenever you need to. But as a default setting, I would definitely recommend keeping X-ray set to 1. Then you can just toggle it on and off using Alt and Z. And one last thing I want to note before moving on is that in wireframe view, we can actually set X-ray to be different than in solid shaded view. So let me press Shift and Z to go over to wireframe view. And let me press / on the numpad to isolate the building. Let's zoom into these discs up here again. Now in wireframe view, X-ray is enabled by default and set to 0 by default. Because of this, we can both see through the model and also select through the model, which makes sense in this mode since nothing is solid in this view, so we should be able to see through it and select through it. You can actually disable this though, and everything will be drawn as wires still, but the objects themselves are not see-through anymore. So let me toggle that back on and off. And as you can see, this can really help simplify your scene and help you visualize things better. But as the default setting for wireframe view, I would recommend keeping X-ray turned on and set to 0. Now let me tab out of edit mode, and I'll press / on the numpad to get back to global view here. And let's move on to something else now. Let's go back up into our viewport shading menu, and let's work with shadow here now. So let me enable that. And this is pretty self-explanatory. As you can see, when I turned it on, it added some shadows being cast onto the terrain. And we can adjust the strength of the shadow with this value here. And if we go into the cog menu right here, we have other options for light direction. Unlike the standard studio lighting, the lighting that's casting the shadows is actually fixed in place, and it won't follow us around when we change the view. So if you do want to change the direction of the shadows, go into the gear menu here, click on the ball there, and just change the direction of the lighting. Now the shadow shift option down here just seems to add some contrast to the shadowing, and the shadow focus here is the softness or sharpness of the shadow. If we turn that all the way up, only the sharpest shadows remain. So let me turn that off, and let's move on to cavity now. So let me enable cavity real quick, and also I'm going to grab that building, press / on the numpad to isolate it in local view again. Let me zoom in on the door here, and take a look at all the edges and all the angles as I turn this off and on. You can see there's definitely some changes being made. Cavity will add extra shading to your objects to help you visualize their angles better. So it's going to make concave angles darker, like this concave angle down there. So it's going to basically just add shadows to cracks and corners. And it'll also make convex angles lighter. So it's going to brighten pointier edges, like on the corner right here. You can see how that gets changed when I turn cavity on and off. Now there's a couple other options for the cavity feature. We have the type right here, and when it's set to world, it seems to have a softer effect. And when it's set to screen, it seems to have sharper lines for more finer details. And then of course, the both option here is going to be a combination of both of them. So let me set that back to world because I like the softer effect better. Now we have some extra options down here for the ridges and the valleys. We can brighten them or darken them. If we crank the ridge up, for example, it's going to brighten those sharper points. But we can also disable that by turning that all the way down to 0. Now we just have the shadowing. And whoops, where'd it go? Let's go back there. Let me put ridge back up to 1. Now the valleys here are for the crevices, the areas that get darkened. If we turn that all the way up to 1, you can see we can make that much darker, or we can turn that off by turning it down to 0. So this option provides you with a nice ambient occlusion type effect to help you visualize your model with some shadowing. And this actually works with separate objects as well. So if I press Shift and D to duplicate this and move it over, you can see the one object here, which is separate, is actually casting a shadow on the other object. So this ambient occlusion effect will cross between objects as well. And let me zoom in a little bit on the shadows. Now, one other option is in the gear icon right here. These are just options to help you fine-tune the shading, including samples, which you can crank up for a higher quality, or you can lower down for lower quality but faster calculations. So let me set that back to default. What was it, 16? I think so. Alright, so that does it for the cavity option. So let me disable that, and next we'll work with depth of field. But first let me press / on the numpad to go back to global view. And depth of field only works in camera view, so let me press numpad 0 to go into camera view. And the depth of field option will take whatever depth of field settings you have for your camera, and it'll actually display that in solid shaded view. So let me enable the camera rig layer here, so I can left click here and actually select the camera. Let's go over to the camera properties here, and you can see we already have depth of field enabled, and we have some settings already set. So let me activate the depth of field option here, and if I zoom in, you can see the foreground here became blurry, where it wasn't before. And let me make that a little bit more obvious by turning f-stop down to 0.04. And there we go. So whatever settings you change here will be displayed in camera view in the 3D viewport in solid shaded view. Alright, moving on. Now the outline option down here will simply draw an outline of your object with a solid color. This can help objects stand out from one another. For example, let's say I added a cube right here, and let me scale it up. If that cube wasn't selected, you would easily see the outline going around it when I turn this option off and on. And that just helps you know where the boundaries of your objects are. And it's also useful because it draws an outline wherever two objects intersect. You can see that outline being drawn right there where the cube intersects the terrain. The important part of that is it also shows that outline still when you're in wireframe mode. So when you're working in wireframe mode, you can't always know if two objects are intersecting, but if you have outline turned on, it still leaves that outline drawn where they intersect. So that can definitely be useful. I've personally found the outline to be problematic sometimes in certain circumstances, so sometimes in certain situations you might want to turn that off. But it doesn't really matter too much. Now let's see what we're up to. We're down to specular lighting down there. Let me get a good view of the terrain here, and you can see the specular highlights shining off the surface. If you wanted to turn them off and get more of a flat kind of general illumination, then just turn specular lighting off, and everything's a little bit more flat. Alright, and that does it for solid shaded view and wireframe view and all of their options. Let me re-enable specular lighting there. And next up, we're going to be looking at Blender 2.8's new Material Preview mode, which is especially good for shader creation because this is a real-time mode that will let you see your results instantly. So solid shading had that texture option up here, which showed you the selected image texture node on your object, but that's as far as that goes. And this is obviously not a good final representation of your shader here. Material Preview mode will actually show you a better representation of your final shader, meaning it'll display image textures, normal maps, procedural textures, and all of that. So you'll get a more accurate visual of your final shader. So let's enable that by pressing the Z key for the Shading Pie menu, and then enable Material Preview. Now depending on how complex your scene and your shaders are, it might actually take a few seconds for everything to load in. And there we go. This is what the final shaders look like. Now this isn't what the final render looks like because it's not taking into account your final lighting setup and everything like that. But this mode is especially useful when creating your shaders because you can instantly preview your shaders as you're building them or changing them up. For example, let me select the building right here. I'll split the view and I'll load in the shader editor again. And let's play around with the normal map values right here. Let's say we didn't know whether or not we wanted the normal map on the roof tiles here to be stronger or weaker. We can simply adjust the normal map value here, and we instantly see those changes in the 3D viewport. And that is just so awesome, and a huge and amazing step up from past versions of Blender, which actually required you to render the scene in the viewport in order to fully preview your shaders, which took up a lot of time. So you can imagine how much of a pain that could be versus just making a change here and instantly seeing those changes in the viewport. Now let me get rid of this. We'll join these back together. So this is a mode that we'll be using all the time, and depending on the complexity of your scene or shaders though, this mode could be a bit slower than solid shading, so we'll still be using solid shading a lot as well. Both modes have their advantages. Now Material Preview has some shading options in the menu up here as well, so let's go through them now. So by default, Material Preview mode is lit up by these HDRI environments, and you can switch these for different looks if you want. And you can also rotate the background using the rotation value here. Now the background option down here shows the studio light or the lighting environment in the background, and it looks like a very blurred version of the background. And you can see that rotate around as we change the rotation value. And we turn that back down to 0. Now, if you already have your own world set up, then you can use those settings to light the environment by enabling the Scene World option right there. So now it's using the HDRI environment set up in the world to light the scene and to display in the background. And we can also light the scene with any light we added to the scene by enabling Scene Lights right here. And there we go. Now, if you're curious about these effects, like the glow and the volumetric lighting, you can enable these over in the render properties right here. When the render engine is set to Eevee, which is Blender's real-time render engine, we have access to these real-time effects which also work in Material Preview, since that mode is actually driven by the Eevee engine. And we'll get into Eevee more later in the course, but as you can see, these effects right here will actually change the way Material Preview mode works as well. Now, keep in mind you don't need to keep the render engine set to Eevee for these effects to work in Material Preview. This is just where you'll find those options. So you can change the options here for Material Preview, but then still set it to a different render engine in the end if you want. Now, when you're in Material Preview and you have both Scene Lights and Scene World turned on, this is pretty much your final Eevee render. But you can see the scene is pretty dark, so it might be hard to build shaders like this. So you'll often want to keep the Scene Lights and Scene World turned off, so you can work with this in a more functional manner and actually be able to see your shaders. And then in order to see the final render, we can switch the shading modes by pressing the Z key for the pie menu, and we can switch that to rendered view. And now we can see our final Eevee render here. And no matter which render engine you have set, rendered mode shows you the final scene using the scene's actual lighting, world settings, and all final shaders. This mode is still just in the viewport, but it shows you the final render of the scene no matter what view you're in, which is really cool. To actually render out your final scene from the camera view, you can either go to the render menu up here and click render image, or you can press F12. And there we go. Now we're going to go over the different render engines later in the course, but just as a primer, there are two main render engines. There's Eevee, which we have it set to now, and you can see it here. And this is a real-time renderer, so it's fast. But it's not a ray tracer though, so the lighting results will not be physically accurate. Now we can also switch the renderer to Cycles, which is Blender's ray tracer. It gives us physically accurate lighting by mimicking how photons actually behave in real life when they bounce around the environment. As you can probably guess, this takes longer to calculate, so your render times will be longer, and that's why this render in the viewport is taking longer and is a lot noisier at first. Both render engines can produce amazing results, but we'll get into both of them later on in the course. Alright, so that's going to do it for all the different shading modes and all the different shading options. So that's going to do it for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.